In the case of like a low blood sugar, it's simply not there. We have a deficiency in energy. Or in the case of high blood sugar, there's fuel that's there, it's sitting in the bloodstream, we're just not able to access it. So it's really in the wrong spot. But either way, and it really increases the stress on the body. And that's really what it comes down to when you talk about blood sugar imbalances. And when it's imbalanced, it affects a lot of different areas and can lead to a lot of different symptoms as well.
Hello and welcome to the PCOS Oracle Podcast, Isaac. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to join me on today's episode. I'm super excited about the topic of our conversation, which is all about blood sugar, insulin resistance, and diabetes, all of which is your speciality. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into today's topic and really delve into the questions and myths we hear about insulin resistance, diabetes, because there are a lot of contradictory ideas and beliefs. It's good to start, breaking them down, figuring out what's, misinformation and things that aren't really truth, because there's a lot of that around in the health industry. So I came across your Instagram a while ago now, and I love your educational content. I highly recommend our listeners to check out your page and follow, of course. So your Instagram handle is @Isaac Pohlman, but I will also have everything linked in the show notes. So before we get into our topic today, can you share with our listeners a little bit about yourself, your journey, and why you decided to, specialize in blood sugar and diabetes?
Yeah. Thanks for that introduction, Despina. Appreciate you having me on first and foremost, and great to be here. As far as my journey and how I got here, originally from the Upper Peninsula, Michigan area, and currently residing in kind of the Chicagoland area. But I grew up really around health and nutrition and outside exercise. I grew up in a very rural area, and it really inspired me to get into health, as far as exercise goes. But in high school, I actually became sick with something called gastroparesis, and had, a series of events that led to kind of hypothyroidism and hormonal imbalances and type 1 diabetes. And eventually, it became clear that a lot of the doctors, while well-meaning, didn't have the resources and knowledge to really help me out. So it really inspired me to look into nutrition as a way to do that. So I started doing a lot of self-research on my own, ended up going into basically studying human physiology and nutritional sciences in a formal way, formal education, but really started diving in deep on my own, experimenting on my own body to figure out, hey, what is the missing pieces with these, and why am I basically experiencing so many symptoms that so many of my friends weren't. So I really started working myself, started seeing some results, and I had a lot of friends asking me, a lot of family members asking me what I was doing, and that's what really drove me further to really seek kind of the root cause of things. A lot of the things that I talk about in my Instagram really aren't taught to us today. We're taught that to treat symptoms with medications, and not so much a part of the lifestyle and nutrition aspect of things. So I weave a lot of those personal experiences into my business, where I specialize with those that are trying to better manage blood sugar. And I really help adults, more so with that pre-diabetes, diabetes, solve that root cause of blood sugar imbalances. And I'm grateful that, that personal experience led me to here, but allows me to really connect with a wide range of people all over the world from diverse backgrounds, and just honored to play, a small role in their health to, really solve some of those root causes.
Awesome. I feel like your story is definitely very inspiring, and it just goes to show that, doctors obviously are super important. Western medicine, medicine does play a role in health. They're at a certain point, but I feel like, with people like you and other people on social media and just general who take this whole root cause and what they call alternative medicine, where they focus on the nutrition, the diet, the lifestyle, and really focusing on building those foundations like the blood sugar balance, I think it's really powerful and inspiring, and it's just very empowering for people to know that they don't have to just, rely on medication and just take how many supplements to, treat an issue which doesn't necessarily get to that root cause or foundation of what's going on. So I think that's amazing. So I guess we can touch on, what is blood sugar, because it's the foundation of the conversation. So we can start off with that, and then why people are commonly told to focus on blood sugar balance. So like, what does it mean? And why is it so important that we do address blood sugar balance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important to really understand something before we understand why it's important, right? Understanding the why. And once we understand that, we really start to relate it to, the importance to us. And blood sugar is really just basically a measure of the carbohydrate found in your blood. It's a main source of energy that our body draws from during times of need. And it's of particular interest and concern for those of us that have, pre-diabetes, type 1, type 2 diabetes, and something called, if you're familiar with kind of the hemoglobin A1C, that's a 3-month average of blood sugar. So I think often it gets the misnomer that it's simply a function of the food that we eat, right? And unfortunately, that's not the case. There's multiple factors that really affect it, from the foods that you eat to stressors to sleep, movement, exercise, weather. So it can really get complicated quite quickly, and frustrating and confusing, which is kind of leads to a lot of conflicts and struggles, that I hear from clients and on social media all the time. So I really like to look at all of those different factors, but one at a time, because it can be so overwhelming with all the things that really impact blood sugar and bringing that into balance. So kind of going into why it's important to have balanced blood sugar. Balancing blood sugar means having a steady supply of that energy reserve. So not too high, not too low. And since blood sugar is a main source of that energy, and we ourselves are energy beings, we run on energy, we don't run on air, right? We need, a constant supply.
Definitely. And I feel like what people do notice, as you listed a lot of those signs and symptoms of whether it's low blood sugar or high blood sugar, when people do simply just start focusing on, that blood sugar balance, a lot of those symptoms do start to go away. Like, they sleep better, they have more energy, there's no brain fog, just more constant energy, up and down, where everyone's obviously, you have that blood sugar roller coaster, it's 1 minute you're up, next minute you're down. So just simply focusing on that really helps address a lot of those symptoms that are just so common, and we think it's normal kind of thing. So let's, I guess, touch on more in depth of blood sugar, high blood sugar, and I guess insulin resistance, because I feel like a lot of the time we link blood sugar, high blood sugar with insulin resistance, but it can also be a low blood sugar issue as well. So I guess, what is insulin resistance? And let's delve into some of those causes or the drivers and maybe like bust a couple of myths in this section here, which I'm sure people are going to be wondering.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, insulin resistance is a confusing term. It's I think it's something that not a lot of people are very clear on. But I will say it's kind of this two-part process, and really what it comes down to is the body's inability to use it properly. And from research, just from my research, I believe that really starts with a few different things. It might start with excess iron, so excess iron being stored away, a high intake of unsaturated fats, and or a lot of physical, emotional stress are often at the center of this to just get this process started. And what these initial factors do is they raise blood sugar. So what happens when blood sugar is raised, our body is really this adapting machine. And when it senses that blood sugar is going out of range, it to compensate, it increases insulin production. So insulin production will go up. And what happens when insulin production goes up, this can make it seem like blood sugar is stable. But if you look at it to a little bit further, if you start measuring insulin levels, you'll see those creeping up, and then blood sugar looking stable, as far as number, hemoglobin A1C. But that's really where some of the problems come into play, because as the amount of insulin that you produce or take as medication rises to those excessive levels, it really desensitizes cells to insulin. So it really prevents them from using the insulin properly, which leads into the insulin resistance, the blood sugar issues, risk for things like prediabetes, weight gain, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes. So that's really where it starts. And some of the drivers that can just kind of make that a little bit worse would be things like meal imbalances. So, too many carbs, too much fat in the diet, not enough micronutrients. So things like B vitamins, copper, potassium, sodium, magnesium, those are all crucial. And then, even things like lifestyle factors. So, lack of sleep and lack of movement can be huge, drivers of that process as well.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of those factors of like focusing on nutrients like B vitamins and the copper, I feel like we often lose sight of how important nutrients play a role in like blood sugar and like I guess avoiding the development of insulin resistance and just making sure the body is functioning, because obviously enzymes and minerals are like foundation in the function of our body. Right. So let's kind of like touch on some of these common I guess diet or lifestyle approaches that I've often recommended that we see people talking all about if you want to reverse insulin resistance, which is like the keto diet of like low carb and then fasting. So obviously there is research to suggest that these are a way of treating insulin resistance and helping blood sugar. So can we like touch on these two popular approaches and kind of explain why they might not actually be helping you?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. And these are all over the internet, and I get this question just about every day. Keto diet or low carb fasting, will that work for blood sugar and addressing insulin resistance? And before I dive into that, I just want to say that if you're having success with that, that's great. I have people reach out to me, all the time over social media, like I had success with that. I saw a decrease in my blood sugar A1C, was able to lose weight, whatever the case may be. So I just want to reiterate, if that's working for you and you've been on it for a long period of time, great. All the power to you. I can only speak to my experience with myself and other clients who may have had success over time, but then started to develop chronic symptoms, worsening blood sugar after doing everything right as far as that diet or lifestyle. So initially, in my experience, you might see some improvements in blood sugar, A1C by fasting, by lowering carbs, but in my opinion, doesn't really tell the full story. And the reason why that's the case is many people believe that balancing blood sugar is simply a result of what they see on the blood glucose meter, that number, what that number is giving them, or on their continuous glucose monitor, what that number is showing. But there's things behind the scenes that are making that happen. So this conversation kind of relates back to something on low blood sugar. So if we were to take, for example, someone that's eating a low carb or ketogenic diet, it might appear that they're balancing blood sugar on their surface and they're getting those results, but what is not seen is what their body has to do to ensure that that's possible and that blood sugar remains stable, which typically only reveals itself the further that you get into a protocol like that. And the reason why that's the case is eating like low carb or ketogenic diet doesn't balance blood sugar. It leads to chronic low blood sugar that the body has to balance. And those two that's a huge difference between those two. So we talked about blood sugar being a reserve of energy, but when we're eating low carb diets, we don't have that to kind of fall back on. So the other only alternative that we do have is our own body tissue. So things like muscle tissue, fat tissue. So we basically break those down in order to make sure that our blood sugar stays in a stable range. And that occurs through stress hormones. So with all these kind of diets and lifestyle changes revolving around fasting and ketogenic diet and low carb, we're really breaking down our own tissues to fuel ourselves, which over time, increases stress on the body, increases insulin resistance, really tanks metabolism, and leads to a lot of those symptoms that we talked about earlier, from really, a lot of changes with energy dips in the afternoon, overall, chronic fatigue, wide changes in mood and appetite and cravings, and just inability to handle any sorts of stressors. And it really primes the body for weight gain too. So you'll see a lot of people who are participating in these diets gain weight in addition to where they were before in the diet. So it really has some wide changing aspects, but a lot of times it's hard to see when you might have some temporary benefits in the short term.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I feel like a lot of people who do follow like keto diet or low carb, they obviously lose a lot of the water weight, because when you eliminate carbs, you obviously retain a lot of the water, and then obviously we're just breaking down the muscle, obviously, to the whole process of like creating the energy from breaking down your own muscle, which is obviously not what we want to be doing, because obviously muscle is very metabolically active and you burn a lot of calories through having more muscle. So I guess, like you explained like very well, like your stance for why keto and fasting. Like you touched on, like a disclaimer, like if it's working for you, it's working for you. But I feel like people have to think long term about how this is going, how this is happening, not just think of like, I guess looking how it happens, how your body's, what's going on for your body to make the energy, not just like, oh, this is the end result. Like thinking about the process and realizing how is this good or is this like not good. So touching on, I guess it kind of links with fasting, but like how often should people be eating? Because obviously when we eat, people are going to be thinking, oh, we're constantly spiking insulin, blood sugar. So is there like that perfect number of meals to be eating, and like is snacking a bad thing to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I get this question and concern a lot, and it's common, right? It's only natural to feel like, especially when you come from the mindset that food is the only thing that affects blood sugar, right? If you're coming from that mindset, of course, it's only going to be natural to feel like, hey, if I'm snacking and eating a lot, it's just going to spike insulin or spike blood sugar. So I think there's so many mixed messages in that area, and that's kind of what I hope to dispel a lot of in my content. So I think it's such a personalized question. It's hard to answer and give, a general guideline, but I will say this, how often you eat really depends on your background as a person. Just as a general guideline, I would say anywhere from, 4 to 6 meals/snacks is really a prime spot. And I find that works for most people. But I always want to go back to the person, their background, their symptoms, and their blood sugar. And as a coach, I find using food logs to be incredibly important with really defining that. And that can be done with working with a coach, or even done on your own to just overall create some awareness around the frequency that works best for you. And I would never recommend, if someone's coming from it, only eating twice a day, I would never recommend them going to, 6 meals and snacks straight away. It's all about, in my opinion, meeting the person where they are and adjusting not based on the guidelines of 4 to 6 meals, but how they're doing in terms of, their blood sugar readings, their energy, their digestion, mood, perceived stress and sleep, appetite. So it's really looking at their symptoms and seeing how they either worsen or improve based on the frequency of their meals throughout the day.
Totally agree. Yeah, you're completely right in saying it's obviously completely personalized and depending on the patient's background, the individual's background, and then working from there. So touching on the topic of food and meals, what would a balanced meal look like? Another question is okay, so if I have a plate of food, how much protein should I be eating? How much fat, how much carbs, etc. Is a ballpark of what people should be thinking about when they're preparing their meals?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this conversation kind of relates back to the previous one too, of understanding where you're coming from as well. So, if a person is coming from a low carb ketogenic background, I'm not going to recommend them to, just jump into carbs, right? That would be like a blood sugar disaster. So again, whenever we approach a balanced meal, that's going to look a little bit differently for each person, depending on which stage of the process that they're in. But in my opinion, just for, everybody, it really starts with consuming all the macronutrients, so including carbs, protein, and fat. Each of those plays a role when it comes to managing blood sugar. Carbs are the body's preferred source of energy. They help to prevent stress, help to activate thyroid hormone, which helps to maintain metabolism. And when you look at metabolism, as metabolism decreases, insulin resistance tends to increase. So kind of going back to how that is connected to blood sugar. When you look at carbs and fat, they both play a role in slowing the release of carbs into the bloodstream. So really preventing those spikes with blood sugar after eating. The thing with fat, it's a little bit trickier because while it does slow the release of the carbs into the bloodstream, it also, if it's too high, it can lead to some insulin resistance issues there too. So it all comes to meal balance and really finding kind of what works for you. But ideally, I find a lot of, my clients, a macronutrient balance where you're eating more carbs than protein, more protein than fat really tends to work for them. But that doesn't mean that they start out that way. For some, that might be starting off with kind of a lowish carb diet until they can, get to a point where they improve their carb tolerance and can begin to start introducing more. But getting started with all three of those macronutrients and playing around with the balance to see what works for them, not only in terms of symptoms, but blood sugar would be a good way to start with that. And then just the last piece that I would say is overall meal density. And I think a lot of times this is something that's not accounted for. So maybe you're eating all the macronutrients, maybe you're having carbs, protein, and fat, but are still seeing kind of your symptoms and blood sugar just being off. So what can usually happen, I think, is very common that the person is eating too light of meals or snacks throughout the day. And when you're eating too light of meals and snacks, those are really absorbed quite quickly. So they lead to this big rise and big fall in blood sugar, leaving you, low in energy, seeing wide changes in appetite, feeling attached to the kitchen and, just feeling moody, when it comes down to it. Whereas if you incorporate some more dense choices throughout the day that absorb a little bit more slowly, it can really help to balance your appetite, really help to satisfy you for hours after eating, provide that lasting energy and stabilize blood sugar. So, I would say more so those three would be my things that I would prioritize for getting those balanced meals in.
So for listeners, what would be comparing a light meal to a more dense meal? What are some examples that they can just compare and be like, okay, this was a light meal?
Absolutely. Yep. And I think that's a common question. What makes up a dense meal? What makes up a light meal? So, I have actually some content on my Instagram page that kind of takes you through this. But as it comes down to it, if you think about light choices, those would be things that don't hold you over for as long. So they could be like, for example, some juice, some orange juice. Now we know it's nutritious, but in the context of holding you over, it's not going to be something that is really going to satisfy your appetite. If you just have a couple gulps of orange juice, it's not going to hold you over. It's going to lead to that rise and fall of blood sugar. Versus if you had an orange, that has some fiber in it, you're chewing it, it takes some time to digest, so that's going to absorb. It's a little bit more dense. It's going to absorb a little bit more slowly. If you look at something like, even like a sweetener, like people will think, honey, it's a good source for a sweetener, but it's not going to hold you over. It's not going to satisfy your appetite. Versus if you look at something like a potato, potato holds you over. It can satisfy your appetite for longer periods of time and doesn't leave you starving after your meal. So it's looking at those choices. And when you look at maybe protein, bone broth is, very nutritious, but it's not going to hold your appetite over versus something like, shrimp or tilapia or grass-fed beef or liver. Those are all those dense choices. It takes your body some time to really digest those versus absorbing, super quickly, like something like bone broth or gelatin.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for providing those examples. And I think a point you mentioned before, obviously, if someone has been like really low carb, you want to get them to go, like you want to just give them a bunch of carbs, obviously, depending on the carb tolerance. And I think people, obviously, there's this whole pro-metabolic kind of, I don't want to say trend, but obviously everybody's trying to focus more on supporting the metabolism. And obviously, if people have come across Dr. AP, everyone knows that, eating a lot of sugar is, not bad. We need, it's a primary fuel source of energy. And I feel like a lot of people who have probably been like really low carb have gone straight into like just consuming loads of sugar, and they've noticed that, they're thinking, oh, this is a bad, I guess, let's call it diet, but it's not necessarily a diet, it's like just the foundations. But people are always like blaming, this is a bad way of eating, you shouldn't follow this way of eating, but it's just basically following, you have to look back and like, what is your journey, like where have you come from? Don't just like jump into something like a new kind of way of eating without really assessing what you've been doing for the past, I don't know, 10 years or however long it's been, because obviously your body has like adapted to that kind of way of eating. So I think I just see a lot of that on like forums and stuff, and I feel like it's important to just touch on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd say the same thing. I think it's so common for people to just jump in and maybe not understanding the background of where they're coming from, and then, experience a lot of blood sugar rises and falls, and just, feeling just like total crap, and then end up kind of gaining weight in the process too. So I think it is always, I think a good message to have is to go slow with everything that you do, no matter where you're going from, taking it one step at a time instead of rushing into the process. Because a lot of times when you try to force things that aren't supportive, that's kind of what tends to happen. You tend to get an increase in symptoms rather than a decrease that you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. And the final point I want to touch on this kind of like topic here is, because this is another common question people ask is, so when you're eating a meal, is there a specific macronutrient that people should eat beforehand? Like, should you eat carbs and then your protein, or like your protein, then your carbs, or like, does this matter, or?
Yeah, and I guess it depends on the person, I think. There's some people that believe that, hey, it's a matter of consuming, protein and fat first, and then, having carbs, and then the kind of the other, part of that would be kind of the overall balance of, carbs to protein to fat. Now, I will say that, each of those plays a role when it comes to managing blood sugar. And I think it's more about finding the balance that works best for you. It's understanding your history. If you're coming from a low carb, ketogenic, background, fasting background, if you're coming from just overly stressed background, it's probably, good to take it slow with that. So maybe, if you're coming from, not eating, any carbs, maybe that's introducing one fruit at one meal during the day and seeing how that goes. And once you're feeling good with that, have that. Maybe it's introducing, 2 fruits throughout the day. And then maybe it's adding in a starch, it's that gradual process, tapering that up. But overall, no matter which way you slice it, I always recommend getting some form of carbs, some form of protein, some form of fat. And the way that you do that really is a little bit more personalized, but that's what I would say, getting all 3 of those in and gradually tapering up to a point where you're seeing a relief of symptoms, you're seeing that your blood sugar is starting to stabilize, and keeping it at that. And sometimes it's not necessarily about making a whole lot of changes, but finding the balance that really works best for you.
Okay, awesome. And obviously the next kind of popular question is the whole glycemic index. Is this something everyone should follow?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of rules that are set within kind of the blood sugar space, and they give us kind of a black or white label that's here's what to stay away from, here's what to eat, and that can make it easier for our minds to interpret. And I certainly empathize with that, because we have so much information on the internet these days that it's hard to know who's right and all this conflicting information. So I really do empathize with that. But it's also something that's very externally driven, right? We're seeking out information, and it never asks us what's working. So I do like to stay away from rules, but at the same time, there are some gold nuggets within the glycemic index that you can kind of take away from. I just don't think that it's something that we should be absolutely governed by. So if you're not familiar with the glycemic index, it's basically a system that assigns a number ranking between 0 to 100, describing how high your blood sugar may rise after eating a particular carb. So basically, the higher the GI, the faster blood sugar will rise. The lower the GI, the slower blood sugar will rise after eating. So in other words, it really describes the quality of the carbs, which is part of the story. There's certainly carbs that are more supportive to blood sugar balance than others, and many of those fall within kind of the lower end of the glycemic index. And the reason why that's the case is you have a carb known as fructose. So it's the carb that really gives fruit its sweet flavor. It's absorbed independently of insulin, and it's beneficial for those that do have insulin resistance, blood sugar issues, because it uses a different pathway than the insulin pathway, which increases carb tolerance and is the reason why fruits are so low on the glycemic index. But the thing with the glycemic index is it doesn't consider everything. So it doesn't consider the quantity of carbs. So for example, watermelon is one of the fruits that actually has a high GI. In 1 cup is only, 12 grams of carbs. Where in comparison, you have white rice, which is also high GI, but contains 45 grams of carbs in 1 cup. So see kind of the difference there. It doesn't track kind of the quantity of carbs. It also doesn't, tell you what you're having with your meal. So eating carbs alone will often lead to blood sugar spikes, which is why I always recommend having a form of protein and fat with your meal. This will really slow the absorption of carbs into the bloodstream and stabilize your blood sugar. So, it's important to look at, hey, what else are you consuming along with these carbs? And then kind of going back to the solid versus liquid carbs, you have an orange that is of a similar GI as orange juice, but you take a couple of swigs of the orange juice and it's almost 30 grams of carbs, versus if you're chewing the orange juice, or the orange rather, you're getting that fiber. It's digesting slowly. It takes time to eat, and it's not going to lead to this huge spike in blood sugar after eating. So there are aspects of the GI that are helpful, but it's not taking into account the full story, in my opinion.
Definitely. And that's just, I had a continuous glucose monitor at one point I was testing out, and I was obviously eating, I was just experimenting, obviously, just to see what the effects of like eating an orange on its own, and just to see people's, I guess, surprise or not surprised, it didn't have like this massive spike that people often think it's going to cause. But I guess that could obviously depend on the individual as well, how they react to to carbs in general. Obviously, I've never been like super low carb in my life, so I guess my carb tolerance isn't as bad as someone who might be coming back from that. But it's just interesting sometimes just to see. So definitely just, looking, using certain things that are commonly suggested, like the glycemic index, but taking it with a grain of salt. And we have to be particular with what we follow, and not to be so absorbed with these rules and like what's off limits and what's on limits and what's bad, and all this. I feel like it gets a little bit overwhelming and just super stressful. So definitely agree with that. I wanted to touch on something that I get asked a lot as well, and I feel like it would be good to touch on this episode. And it's basically if anyone's had the continuous glucose monitor, or simply if they, the question is like, why does blood sugar spike while you're sleeping? So like early hours in the morning, why do we notice like a spike at 3 o'clock in the morning? And obviously people realize this when they go to the toilet and they can't fall back to sleep. So like, what is the cause of that?
Absolutely, absolutely, and this is a question I get a lot too. And I actually just made a post on this, and it's a result of a few different patterns, in my opinion. And overall, the general trend of that is something known as the dawn phenomenon. So as the name suggests, it's a trend that occurs in the morning and refers to the release of extra glucose from the liver, resulting in an increased fasting blood sugar. And this is one of the most common blood sugar trends that people will see. So if you're experiencing that, you're certainly not alone. And there's nothing more frustrating when you feel like you've done everything right, but blood sugar still seems to be high in the morning. So a few different factors that come into play. One, I would say, lack of movement throughout the day. That is really important when it comes to reducing insulin resistance. And the more that you do that, the more that you'll see those fasting numbers decline. Another one would be eating too much iron, fortified iron products, or storing too much iron away. That's a huge cause of extra glucose release. And then not consuming enough magnesium. That's another one that really prevents those elevated fasting readings. But if I were to say what I see as a coach most often too is overall meal patterns. And this is so common. I see clients consuming, or rather not consuming meals, skipping meals, or eating lightly for breakfast or snacks early on in the day. And maybe we made a habit out of, maybe we're engaging like a fasting protocol, or we're skipping meals out of habit, have a lot of demands early on in the day. Maybe we don't feel hungry in the morning, or it's just a matter of going back to our previous conversation of not wanting to spike blood sugar, right? Avoiding food. So, no matter what the reason is, it can really set us for blood sugar issues for the rest of the day, along with the next morning. And why is this the case? Well, when we miss earlier meals earlier on, we're missing out on that valuable nutrition. We're not refueling that energy reserve. And this increases stress on the body. And in the nutrition biz, we call this running on stress hormones. And this contributes to kind of a rise in blood sugar over the course of the day. And in order to compensate that, we may find ourselves needing more stimulants like coffee, and experience cravings for overly processed foods, and find ourselves consuming a lot of our calories and meals towards the end of the day to really make up for what we didn't have earlier on. So essentially what ends up happening is we have a deficiency in energy coming in during the day, and then an excess at night. And that's what often leads to this pattern where you'll see blood sugar imbalances up during the day, and then a rise in the morning, and then the pattern just repeats itself. So, in order to really reverse this pattern, looking at the habits during the early parts of your day can give you some clues of how to best support you, throughout the day and achieve those stable blood sugars the next morning. And, they've done studies on this where those with diabetes will fast and their blood sugar will end up rising, all throughout the rest of the day. Whereas if they had a simple breakfast meal, it really stops that rise. And sometimes it can really be that simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely have breakfast. So do you think this is another kind of thing people always ask is there a specific time that people should stop eating before they go to bed? Or is it okay to have like a little snack that's got protein, carbs, and some fat to help sustain you through the night to avoid that spike in blood sugar?
Yeah, and some people need that. Some people need that support towards the end of the day. Some sort of small snack can be helpful, where others, may not need it. And I think it goes back to that personalization and really doing the work to understand what is going to work best for you. And sometimes that comes with a trial and error. Figure out, maybe testing it out, having a snack before bed with carbs, fat, and protein, and see how you feel and how your blood sugars are in the morning. See how that goes versus maybe not having a snack and seeing how you feel in the morning, how your blood sugars are. And sometimes that can really give you some insights into how to proceed, moving forward too. So again, it goes back to creating that awareness around what works best for you, because I have clients that don't have a snack before bed and their blood sugars are balanced in the morning, they're feeling well, and then others that might need that support. And those that really need that more support, I tend to be the people that are coming from the more stressful backgrounds. So the ketogenic diets of the world, the low carb, the fasting, those tend to be the people that are really needing that support, because what happens, during the night when you're in kind of a lower health state, your body runs out of something called liver glycogen. So when we run out of that fuel reserve, we have to resort to a backup. And that backup is stress hormones that increases insulin resistance, increases that fasting blood sugar in the morning. So that could be another reason as to why a snack can be supportive for those types of folks.
Interesting. So let's touch on the last kind of questions, which are like a wrap up of what we've just said, because obviously there's been a lot that we've touched on. So the first one is a recap of ways to improve blood sugar. So I guess if you want to say top things that you suggest our listeners to focus on for blood sugar balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think we chatted about a lot. We talked about stress. We've talked about meal balance. We talked about nutrient status, sleep, movement throughout the day. And that can often be overwhelming to just understand all of those factors that go into blood sugar balance. And I think that the key with that is really just taking it one step at a time and starting to create awareness around maybe what that one biggest challenge for you is, and just getting started with that. And maybe it's, you're having a lot of stress at home or at work, and maybe it's working on ways to help to manage that. You can certainly do that through the nutrition, but maybe that's setting, more firm boundaries at home. Maybe that's prioritizing, some fun throughout your day to day. Or, maybe that's getting some more movement into your day. Maybe you're sitting at a desk job for most of the hours of the day and incorporating maybe walks after meals. It could be as short as 5, 10, 15 minutes. So I would say getting started with just one of those at a time to make it less overwhelming, but also to improve kind of the sustainability. Because when you look at all these different factors all at once, it becomes this unsustainable process, in my opinion, and leads a lot of people into just feeling overwhelmed and wanting to give up, versus empowering them to see, be able to see some results and taking it one step at a time, which I find is often works out the best.
Interesting. So, and then the final kind of question is, which I guess, like I said, it kind of matches in with that previous question, is for people who do suffer from insulin resistance, what are some of those steps? From now or from tomorrow, whenever they listen to the episode, where should they start from? What are those steps?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, and I think it starts with finding a meal strategy that works for you. So the types of food that you're eating, the types of carbs, the types of fats, types of proteins, I'd really dial that in. The frequency throughout the day. The balance, to your meals. I believe it really starts with nutrition, in my opinion. But a lot of times, some people aren't ready for that. So again, going back to that biggest challenge for them, maybe it's working on stress before you work on nutrition, or maybe it's working on movement. But when it comes to really getting at the root cause, when you are ready for that, starting to find that meal strategy, in my opinion, is really where to start. And then once you really find that meal frequency, and sometimes that either comes from really doing the work on your own or working with somebody that you trust, like a coach. I think they can give you some really valuable feedback as far as where to go with that. And next I would say, looking at the meal balance. So between the carbs, proteins, and fat, what is going to support you right now, not later down the line, what's going to support you right now to really help to balance out your symptoms that you're experiencing, balance out your blood sugar. And again, that might start with a lower carb diet at first, but being open to increasing that, tapering that up over the course of time as your carb tolerance improves. And to really start improving that, and micronutrients can be important. So things like sodium and potassium and magnesium are things to really look for in your foods, in your carbs, in your protein, in your fat, to really help to treat those root causes of the insulin resistance and blood sugar issues. And other things would be kind of the movement out throughout the day and identifying your stressors. But in my opinion, that the nutrition is really going to get you that root cause, addressing that, and then typically the other things kind of take care of themselves after you get that into place too.
Interesting, yeah. And if for people that want to find out more about the nutrients and specific, I guess, the minerals that are supportive of insulin resistance and diabetes, definitely check out Isaac's Instagram page. Like I said, I have that linked in the show notes. But to wrap up, how can our listeners connect with you apart from like Instagram? Like, how can they find you and work with you, etc.? Like, share all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So I have my website. It's www.isaacpohlman.com. So that's another way you can kind of check out more about me, learn about my coaching program called the Balanced Blood Sugar Roadmap. Currently taking on clients that have prediabetes and diabetes that are just struggling to treat that root cause of their blood sugar imbalances. So you'll see kind of an application page for that. Also, if you're looking to just get started with things, I'm offering a free report. It's called 5 Steps to Improve Insulin Resistance. So that's something that you can download for free just to kind of get started, and it kind of takes you more in depth around our conversation today. So that can be a great starting place. And I'm open, on Instagram. That's kind of my main channel. I have a page on Facebook as well. I'm on Twitter, but barely really use that. Don't interact with that much. So mainly Instagram, Facebook, and then my website is ways to kind of reach out and get in touch with me.
Awesome. I have everything in the show notes. I have the website, I have your your guide in the show notes. Everything will be there. Thank you so much. If our listeners, if you're looking for to get to the root cause of your diabetes, insulin resistance, to find out more about blood sugar balance, definitely check all that content out, and definitely that'll be the way to go if you're fed up of not doing all this stuff but not fully fixing the issue. Definitely go educate yourself and all that amazing information that Isaac has. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to share your knowledge, inspire people and educate them on blood sugar, insulin resistance. It's been very, very interesting, and I've personally also learned a lot from you. So thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Despina. Appreciate it.